Okay, thank you very much for this gracious introduction. So this time, what I want to do is, I'm not going to say much about God, except actually in a negative way, how God doesn't solve at least in one way, some of these problems that I'm going to raise. And then I will come back to God on Thursday and show how this line of thought does, in fact, lead towards theism. So, start with a quick review of Aristotelian metaphysics, which is what I'm going to be giving at least a kind of argument for this time, or showing the kinds of advantages one gets from Aristotelian metaphysics. So, Aristotle and his followers, like Thomas Aquinas, think we're composed of three types of components: matter, form or nature, I'm going to use those words interchangeably, and accidents, which are properties you have but you don't have to have. They're things like your eye color, your height, your philosophical interests, and so on. The component that I'm going to be most interested in, and that I'm going to be arguing for the existence of, is the form. So the form of a thing is some kind of a metaphysical component of an entity that does a number of important tasks for Aristotelians. The first is it unifies the matter into a thing. So you've got a whole bunch of matter and it makes up a human being, in my case, because there's a form that unifies it. Secondly, the form of a thing is supposed to provide objective norms for how the thing should function according to the kind of thing it is. The form of a thing is supposed to be, for Aristotle, the same in everything that's of the same kind. So all human beings have a form that's exactly alike. It specifies exactly the same objective norms. It unifies the matter in exactly the same way. And finally, so the first is a metaphysical task. The second is a normative task. It specifies objective norms. And the third thing that the form does is it guides the characteristic activity of the thing that has the form towards the fulfillment of these norms. In the case of human beings, sometimes it does this through our desires, which lead us to doing the things that are good for us, sometimes at least. The norms in the form do not reduce to statistical facts. So you could think, okay, what's a normal heart? It's a heart of median size in the population. That's not the Aristotelian picture of norms. You don't need a form to make sense of norms that are just statistical like that. You just do the statistics. The kind of intuition behind this is something like this. If you have somebody who goes around and mutilates every panda by cutting off an ear, the normal number of ears for a panda is still 2, even though the majority of pandas have only 1. And you can say, well, but if you count over time, you still have all these 2-eared pandas in the past. Well, maybe this happened like in the second generation of pandas, and so it's actually the majority of pandas over all time have only 1. But nonetheless, that's an abnormal status. And the reason it's abnormal on this Aristotelian picture is because it is contrary to the specifications in the form of the panda. However, by number 3 in the things the form does, statistically, typically, the organism's functioning will be within a normal range. So typically, things that are supposed to have 2 ears statistically tend to have 2 ears. It's an abnormal kind of case. It takes violence, for instance, to produce this kind of case where the pandas have the wrong number of ears, typically. Okay, so I'm going to, in this lecture and Thursdays, which are very much a unity, argue for two things. The first thing is that we have forms that do not reduce to the arrangement of matter. And that will take me all of today and the start of Thursday. And then on Thursday, I will argue that this kind of Aristotelian metaphysics, for it to do the kind of tasks I wanted to do, and for it to avoid obvious objections, especially in light of the fact of evolution, it needs theism, or something, some other deeply metaphysical, value-laden view like theism, like maybe pantheism or optimalism or something like that. Okay, so the line of thought is going to be like in Lewis's plurality of worlds. Lewis argues for a plurality of worlds on the grounds that supposing such a plurality is extremely useful because it solves a number of problems. So I will be today discussing two problems that supposing Aristotelian forms helps solve. And then I will give a few more next time. It'll actually, the ones in red I'm doing today, ethics and epistemology, then there are 4 for next time, but they're going to go quickly, except for the philosophy of mind. Because I'm going to actually spend most of the time on ethics today, then quickly talk about epistemology. It's once you see how it goes for ethics, the other things are going to be fairly easy adaptations. And specifically, today I'll be talking about the specificity of apparently arbitrary parameters. So it'll be kind of something like the fine-tuning argument, but not quite. Okay, so I came to this line of thought by reading this obscure French book by Mersenne, who's not an obscure guy. He's like a great 17th century polymath who was kind of like the central repository of all scientific knowledge of his time. People would tell him things that they discovered. He would tell it to others what he had heard of their discoveries. He was just doing all sorts of really cool stuff. We've got in mathematics, the Mersenne primes are named after him. He was probably, as far as I can tell, the first person to notice that the crucial premise in the ontological argument is that it's possible for God to exist. I'm not going to be talking about this, but he discovered this sometime before Leibniz did. And he has this argument that he goes on for page after page, granted big type, small pages, to develop. And it starts with this whole set of questions that he asks. And here's a few of those. Who gave more strength to the lion than to the ant? Who made it be that the earth is not in the moon's place and the planets aren't larger or smaller, closer or further? Who has ordered all the parts of the world as we see them? And now he's drawing on the best science of his day. Why is the moon 56 Earth radii away from the earth? Why is the sun 1182 away from us at its apogee? And why is its distance at perigee not other than 1101? I could equally ask you about Saturn and Jupiter and Mars. And in case you're wondering, he does ask about all these, about a whole bunch of other objects. He just goes on and on, giving lists of numbers. So it's like he's taken all these scientific measurements that were made and just is asking, why are they like that? And of course, you can kind of expect where he's going. His answer to the questions is a rhetorical question. Was it not God who did all these things? Who gave more strength to the lion and the ant, and so on? Now, when I first looked at this, my French isn't that good. I read fairly slowly. So as I was reading this, I was thinking, this is looking like a fine-tuning argument. So I was then sort of looking forward and seeing, what's going on? Is he going to give us some kind of an argument that all these things are wisely set up? No. But let's look at first at fine-tuning arguments, just to see the contrast with what Mersenne is doing. So the contemporary fine-tuning argument is something like this. We have some constant, let's say xi, which occurs in the laws of nature, and let's say it turns out to be measured at 3.452. And then the fine-tuning arguer makes three different claims, typically. First, a claim I call good, that xi being approximately 3.452 supports life. So usually that comes with these arguments that if xi is much less than this value, then it's going to not support life, or it's much bigger, then it also won't support life. Now, by xi is just a completely made up constant, but you can do this with all sorts of things like the strength of gravity, the mass of the electron, all sorts of stuff like that. Okay, so the first is that it's supposed to be good in some way, namely, typically because it supports life. The second thesis is that it's likely, and this is usually derived from the good claim, well, it's likely on the hypothesis that God exists. So this says that if God exists, we would expect xi to be like that. Why? Because God likes life. And if that's what you need for life, then God's probably going to make it like that. But there's also a claim of unlikely that comes with this, that it's really not very likely that you would have it be equal to that if there were no God, because, well, I mean, the common thing to say is, look, there are so many values it could take, anywhere maybe from 0 to infinity, I guess, maybe even from negative infinity, depending on what kind of constant it is. And why should it be in this whatever approximately 3.452 if there were no God to set it so because it supports life? So the conclusion is probably God exists and creative activity explains why xi has approximately that value. I'm not going to be trying to defend this argument here. I want to look at how Mersenne's is similar and different. Mersenne can get an analog to the unlikely claim. And I think he definitely wants us to have such an analog in our minds. He gives all these details, and he thinks it's very unlikely the laws of nature are going to predict these precise values. 1101 distance at perigee, that sort of thing. But what Mersenne doesn't seem to have anywhere in the argument is any analog to the thesis I labeled good, that these values support life or do anything else that is valuable. And hence, he doesn't seem to have any argument that it's likely. So yeah, it's unlikely that without God you would have these values, but it seems to also be unlikely with God, because we haven't given any reason why God would make them be that way. I don't think Mersenne is after anything like the fine-tuning argument. I think he's thinking something like this. First, we've got a premise that he never states. Something like the principle of sufficient reason, that every contingent thing has an explanation. Secondly, I think the reason he's listing all this detail is because he wants to convince us that there's so much of it looks so arbitrary that it's not going to be necessary. These numbers kind of look at random. They don't look like the sort of thing that you get of necessity. You think of Kepler's, it has this beautiful universe where the solar system is nested using Platonic solids. And there you can see, yeah, maybe it has to be like that. But these numbers don't look like that. They look too arbitrary. So the second thesis is it doesn't have to be this way. The third thesis is that science cannot explain all this detail. God's creative activity can, however, so he concludes that probably God exists and his creative activity explains the detail. That's, I think, what he's doing. Let me make a few comments about the quality of this argument. I don't think he needs, I think he probably is thinking about the principle of sufficient reason or something like it, but he doesn't need to. He could just do an inference to best explanation. He spends a lot of time giving the detail to support the not necessary claim and maybe the not science claim. The creation thesis, that God's creative activity can explain things, is unproblematic. Where I think he fails is in the claim that science cannot explain this detail. And the excuse, I think he has an excuse for failing, which is that at that time, science was highly deterministic and the scientific model was purely deductive. And so a scientific explanation was supposed to be a deduction of why it has to be like that and why it has to be exactly like that. And you're not going to, it just seems super unlikely that from the laws of nature you will deduce that the Earth at perigee is 1101 times the radius of the Earth, the distance from the sun, or whatever exactly the numbers were. But we now know that there are perfectly good explanations that can involve chance. Quantum mechanics does this. Maybe the initial conditions of the universe are chancy and random, and that can produce all sorts of output billions of years later that looks pretty random. So I think once you take into account that science can explain the arbitrary detail with random processes, the argument no longer works. But I want to argue for it in a different way, using the same rough strategy of giving you this long lists of detail, but without the numbers. But in my case, there are going to be cases where science is useless because they're just not in the domain of science. So I'm going to have something like this, or inference to best explanation, this, and this thesis is going to be really easy for me. But what will take some work is arguing that there aren't other philosophical explanations of the things. Moreover, I'm not going to start by arguing for the existence of God like Mersenne does, but for there being such a thing as a human nature that is a normative entity. Okay, so I will start with parameters in ethics. And I'll start with this example I got from Thomas Aquinas. So Thomas says that normally you should benefit your relatives over your strangers, and specifically you should benefit your father over a stranger. But Thomas says, yes, that's only true all other things being equal. What if, a stranger is starving and your dad wants dessert? You should give this is my example, not his. You should give the dessert to the stranger who's starving rather than to your dad who's already quite full. Right? So if the benefit to a stranger is much larger, Thomas says you should benefit the stranger. Now, Thomas then immediately asks, how much larger does the benefit to the stranger have to be? And I'll tell you a little bit later what his answer to that question is, but I want to just pause on this question. So this is a question that applies to all sorts of relationships, obviously, not just between fathers and children, but mothers and children and siblings and friends and colleagues and all sorts of relationships, right? And it needs to take into account lots of detail, is how needy is one's father? Has one's father been a particularly good father or not, etc., etc. Lots and lots of highly relevant detail. Who is this stranger? Are there other people available to help this stranger? Lots and lots of detail is available. So presumably there seems to be some sort of principle that we want to have that says that you should benefit one person over another in some circumstances when the benefit is bigger than, well, some kind of a function of the person you're benefiting over, the person you're benefiting, and the circumstances. Now, it would be really great if we could come up with and say what the function f is. I have no idea. But that's not the question I want to raise. Just as, it's not Mersenne's task to measure the distance between the Earth and the Sun. I want to ask, what makes it be the case that whatever this function is, it is what it is? Why is the switchover between benefiting your father, for when the benefits are equal, to benefiting the stranger where it is? So Thomas thinks, and I think he's right, that if the benefit to the stranger is only slightly larger than to the father, you should benefit your father. But he's not a utilitarian here. But if it's much, much larger, then you should benefit the stranger. So somewhere there's a switchover. What explains the place where the switchover takes place? That's the kind of question I want to ask. There's some other questions of the same sort. So here's an observation. You can be reasonable. I think I got this from Peter van den Wagen. You can be reasonable in choosing between being a decent mathematician and a decent musician in choosing whichever way. You can choose one or the other, and it'll be fine. You'll be quite reasonable in doing so. But if your mathematical talents are poor and your musical talents are great, then it would be unreasonable to choose to be a weak mathematician over a superb musician. And likewise, it would be unreasonable to choose to be a weak musician over a superb mathematician. Being a musician and a mathematician seem to be incommensurable goods. There doesn't seem to be a common scale we could put them on and measure them numerically. But nonetheless, there's some kind of a principle that, when you are choosing between a great degree of one and a small degree of the other, it's very much like in the father and child case of Aquinas, you should go for the great degree of the one over the small degree of the other. And again, we have this Mersenne-like question, why are the values where you have to switch over from supporting one to the other as they are? What makes it be the case that, so if there's a slight difference, it seems to go like you can still make a reasonable choice either way. But if it's a big difference, it doesn't seem like it's reasonable. Still on incommensurable things in ethics. Other things being equal, I think we should prefer social goods over solitary pleasures. Of course, not all social goods, not over all solitary pleasures. Those I think are incommensurable. Again, I don't think there's like a numerical scale or clear comparison between every case that you can make. But there's still some kind of sense in which the social goods are better than the solitary pleasures. And here, it's not so obvious that this is non-arbitrary. Sorry, it's not so obvious that this seems that there's anything arbitrary about it. You might say, well, but the social goods, they're just way better. Well, think about intelligent sharks. If you have intelligent sharks, a very different set of choices might be reasonable for them. They might, be reasonable to prefer the solitary pleasures over living in a community. It seems like there's something about us humans that's relevant here. So again, I think we've got a kind of Mersenne question. Why is the ordering for us as it is? And if there were any intelligent sharks, which I assume there aren't, we would have the question, why is the ordering for them other than it is for us? Here's another thing along the same lines. As in Mersenne's case, I'm going to go on for a while just to drum it in that there's many such questions. So some people will accept a 92% chance of winning $1,000 at the cost of a 9% chance of losing $10,000. And some people won't, right? And I think both can be rational. I think they both are very rational attitudes. Granted, the expected payoff for the first one is slightly higher than for the second one. For the first one, the expected payoff is 9,200, right? Sorry, yeah. Sorry, the expected payoff is slightly positive if you just work it out. But nonetheless, it's reasonable to be afraid of the risk of losing $10,000. But there are attitudes towards risk that would be irrational. So here's something that seems to me to be true. I don't know if this is a thought experiment you may disagree with, but I think it's actually right. There's no finite good G, so that for a 1 in 10,000 chance of that good, it's worth risking a 99.99% chance of certainty, 99.99% chance of a century of the worst tortures the KGB was capable of. You could make, now notice that if G is high enough, the expected utility is going to be positive. You could make, billions and billions of years of the most exquisite of pleasures. And you multiply the value of that by 0.01%, and you can still get something pretty big. That seems bigger than that century of the worst tortures the KGB is capable of, but nonetheless, for such a tiny chance of that great good, it's just not worth it. I leave open the question whether for an infinite good it might be worth it or not. But I think for a finite one, it's, I think, pretty clearly not worth it. So there are going to be rational and irrational attitudes towards risk. Maximizing expected utility is perfectly fine in the first case, but not in this one. On the other hand, some risks are such that you would be irrational to not be willing to face them, right? A tiny risk of a tiny loss versus a large victory. So there's going to be a distinction between rational attitudes towards risk and irrational attitudes towards risk. These are going to depend also on other issues like your relationship to those to whom the risk is. And this distinction goes beyond the easily calculated expected utility calculus. And then we can ask lots of other things. So here's just a little laundry list. If like me, you're a strict deontologist, you will say you shouldn't torture one innocent person to save 1 million, but it's perfectly okay to induce a pinprick in them. Okay, but where do you draw the line between the pinprick and the torture? Or if you're not like me, you're like my friend Phil Swenson, you might be a threshold deontologist. You might say, well, you shouldn't kill 1 innocent person to save 2, but you should kill 1 to save 1 million. Here's another thought. Seems like when a government becomes sufficiently unconcerned with the well-being of the people, it becomes illegitimate. Nazi Germany, for example, is a clear case. Punishment should not be disproportionate to the gravity of the offense and the culpability of the offender. It's reasonable and morally permissible to tolerate a small risk of condemning the innocent so as to not let the guilty go free. If we like something like the principle of double effect, we have this idea of tolerating an unintended bad effect for the sake of a sufficiently great good. Here's another one. This is actually kind of an interesting thing that just interests me for reasons completely different from this series of talks. The consent standards for sex are significantly higher than for medical procedures. Children cannot get proxy consent for medical procedures, even ones that are life-threatening, like donating organs to a sibling. But parents are not capable of giving proxy consent for sex for their children. And we can give other sort of presumed consent is enough for the doctor in the case of medical procedures in emergency situations. Even in emergency situations, presumed consent is probably not good enough for sex. Harder to imagine the emergency situations, but maybe you can imagine cases of the last 2 people on Earth, and they only have 5 minutes together, or something like that. So the standards of consent are higher. So again, we have all these comparisons, these kinds of vague and uncomfortable words like sufficiently, proportionate, notably, and then these examples like 2 versus a million, which can't be the narrowest you can make it. Why? I don't know where these lines are to be drawn in these cases, but I want to ask the Mersenne question of wherever they are to be drawn, why are they to be drawn there rather than elsewhere? Okay, so let's look at some possible answers. So probably the most promising one is act utilitarianism. In each case, you just try to maximize utility. The lines are always contextual, which just actually makes sense intuitively for a lot of these cases. And so you try to maximize utility. Now, for me, the main reason not to like that is just all the standard counterexamples to act utilitarianism. Now, if you like to act utilitarianism, just rehearsing those me saying that these counterexamples exist will not impress you, but it also wouldn't impress you to actually give them because you know them. So I'm not going to give them. The second thing I want to say though about act utilitarianism is that I think it also raises Mersenne questions of its own. So, from Mill we learn, that some pleasures are not all equal, and any kind of hedonistic utilitarianism is going to have a hierarchy of pleasures. And I think likewise any desire fulfillment utilitarianism is going to have a hierarchy of desires. And we have questions about where that hierarchy comes from. Second option, some kind of relativism, individual or social. So you just don't be a non-realist about the ethics. That doesn't actually answer the question of these lines, because in fact, I don't think either the individual or society has settled where the lines are. I guess on the relativist story, if we haven't settled where the lines are, there is no fact of the matter as to where they are. And our agonizing, in some of these cases, you might well agonize if it's a high stakes case, is unreasonable because in fact, there's just no fact of the matter. And you might as well just settle either way and then you'll be right automatically. Interestingly, I think there's a kind of Mersenne question of its own raised by relativism. So if it's individual relativism, you can, so it's what you believe to be right is right. But belief is something that comes in degrees. There's surmise, there's suspicion, there's, some kind of low degrees of confidence, higher degrees of confidence. Which one of these is what defines the right? And on social relativism, you could ask a question, what degree of consensus in a society is needed to constitute the right? So I think active utilitarianism and relativism maybe get out of a number of these questions, but they don't, but they create a few new ones of their own. Virtue ethics was Aquinas' own answer to this question. So when he asks what is to be done, when do we prefer our father to a stranger and the stranger to our father, he says that there is no rule to be given. You should do as the virtuous person would do. I think that just pushes the question back. What makes it be the case that the virtuous person should act the way that they should act in these cases? And I don't think Aquinas is taking himself to be giving an answer to the Mersenne type question of why these lines are there, they are, where they are. I think he may be just trying to give an answer to the practical question of how you tell. I guess you're supposed to imagine the virtuous person and see where do I think they would lie. Another option, you might say, it's just a brute fact. These are unexplained, necessary truths about ethics. And here I think this is where the Mersenne's line of reasoning becomes relevant, because there are so many of these distinctions, and it doesn't seem like there are natural lines for them to be drawn. It seems uncomfortable to have these brute necessities that are, sort of seem kind of arbitrary looking. Like, you could think that it's just brutally necessary that the distance from the Earth to the Sun at perigee is 1101 Earth radii, but it seems implausible. And in general, brutishness should be a last resort in philosophy and elsewhere. Perhaps a more satisfactory option is to, act utilitarianism has its counterexamples. What about rule utilitarianism? So there we could give actually a nice story as to where the lines are to be drawn. We draw them in those places where we're going to get the most valuable consequences. We don't know where those places are, but at least we have a principled ground for what makes the right answer, whatever it is, be the right answer. It's the rule that will lead to the best utility. So there's a benefit to us being particularly nice to our parents. It encourages them to be nice to their children in the past. But of course, past a certain point, the cost of being nice to our parents at the expense of strangers is too high. So you could imagine doing this gigantic calculation of what kind of a rule you would want to enact that would produce the best overall consequences. And maybe that overall optimization of the rule is going to do the job. That might help. That's, I think, a very nice form of an answer. But I think there are some problems. And one of these is that first you have Mersenne questions for the hierarchy of goods on rule utilitarianism, just as an act utilitarianism. You need a hierarchy of pleasures or of desires. Also, there's a standard issue in that rule utilitarianism has a tendency to collapse into act utilitarianism because it seems like the best rule is just maximize utility. Well, maybe, but that's a hard rule to follow because it's hard to calculate what the best utility, what maximized utility. So you might say, well, that would be kind of if you idealize things, that's the best rule, but we shouldn't idealize things. Maybe what we should do is follow rules such that if all tried sufficiently hard to follow them, we would get the best results. So we would inject a note of realism into our optimization of the rules. But I think we are going to get Mersenne questions as to how much realism should be injected into these. How hard should we look? Should follow the rules such that if all tried sufficiently hard to follow them, the results would be optimal. Just how hard is sufficiently hard? Okay. Here's another very, very plausible answer is, well, look, the lines are drawn in vague places, objectively vague. Now here, I am an epistemicist about vagueness. Let me give you, rehearse the standard kind of argument for this. It seems to me, classical logic tells us there has to be a place where these lines are to be drawn. So imagine that this material conditional is true for all n. If giving $n to a stranger is less good than giving 100 to one's father, then giving n plus 1 to a stranger is also less good than giving 100 to one's father. Well, let's look at this. Giving $0 to a stranger is definitely less good than giving $100 to one's father. So we've got the antecedent of this conditional for n equals 0. Right? If we've got this conditional true for all n, then you apply it with n equals 0 and you conclude that giving $1 to a stranger is less good than giving $100 to one's father. You apply it again and you find giving $2 to a stranger is less good than giving $100 to one's father. You apply it 1,000,000 times and you find out that giving $1 million to a stranger is less good than giving 100 to one's father. And that's, I think, an absurd conclusion. I guess for the scenario, I'm thinking of a costless giving. you have a way of just pushing a button and they get that. But you can push only the one button for one's father or for the stranger. So you apply modus ponens over and over with this if you have this holding for all n and you get absurdities. So logic says, classical logic says, the material conditional has got to fail for some n. And you can pretty easily convince yourself that if it fails for some n, then for all bigger n it's true, because the antecedent for all the bigger n will be false. So it can fail for at most one n. So there's one n where it fails. So there is actually a cutoff, logic says, even if we don't know where. This is an ethics version of an argument Sorensen makes. I went backwards. Okay. Well, you might say, yeah, but still, look, doesn't it look like our language is vague? And our ethical language is vague as well. Maybe we have these complex linguistic practices. Did I skip some? No. We have these complex linguistic practices that determine how the words right and wrong should be used. We're not in a position to say how these practices work in detail, and hence we're not in a position to say exactly what the boundaries of the words right and wrong are. This is the epistemicism. But our ethical language does, in fact, determine the answers to these questions. So this would be an answer to the Mersenne problems. It would be saying the explanation for why you should draw these lines is because this is how we use the words right and wrong. Now, I think this is only going to be plausible if questions of ethics are merely verbal. I don't think it fits with our agonizing over ethical decisions. Our language changes over time. We could just enact more convenient uses of language for us if we wanted to. I think in practice this is too much like relativism. Here's another option. Here's another maybe thought I had about this stuff, about the vagueness. So I do feel the pull to saying that some of these things are vague. So maybe these lines between these different decisions are vague. But if they're vague, there's going to be some kind of vagueness profile. You know, for n $5, it's going to be vague, and for n 10, it'll be definite. For n 11, it'll be not just definite, but definitely definite. For n 9, vaguely definite. At n 4, vaguely vague, and at n 6, definitely vague. Because after all, if it's vague, we can go back and ask, okay, so here you have to help your father, here it's vague, here you have to help the stranger. Where's the transition between the have to do this versus vague? Well, that's probably, here you're clearly to one side of transition, here clearly to the other, but then there will be an area where it's vague. And so you're going to have a second order vagueness, and you can go on, and you have this kind of build up this vagueness profile, which means that you started with one Mersenne question as to what the cutoff value n is, and now you got an infinite number of them as to where the full scale of this vagueness profile is. I don't like that. Here's another option. You know, so in physics, one of the less popular answers to the fine-tuning argument is that we will one day have a physics theory where there aren't any arbitrary parameters. All the parameters are highly natural things like 2 and pi and e and things like that, and everything else can be derived from there. I think a lot of physicists are skeptical of whether that'll happen. But even if it's plausible in physics, I don't think it's going to be that plausible in ethics. That we're going to have a final ethics with very elegant parameters, and everything else, all these messy decisions can then be derived from these parameters. I think the kind of thing that makes physicists think we're not going to get this in physics is just there's a whole lot of these parameters. We don't really see our way to a final theory that doesn't have arbitrary parameters. And the parameters look contingent. And I think exactly the same thing is true on the ethics side. I want to emphasize on the appearance of contingency. Think of intelligent sharks. It seems to me that whatever the theory is going to, the ethical theory is going to be, it's going to be unlike physics, which is one thing for the universe. It's probably going to be one thing for us, and another for the Martians, another for the Klingons, and so on. Another for the sharks. Also, in ethics, pi looks unnatural to me. It's hard to say what numbers are actually natural in ethics. Here's an option. When I first came out with these arguments, I thought this was actually a great option, which is divine command theory. So, we've got these kinds of problems practically in our daily life. How fast should cars be allowed to go on this stretch of the road? And we don't settle it by a priori figuring it out. We settle it by legislation, right? We set speed limits, we set tax rates, we solve coordination problems by setting reasonable values to arbitrary parameters. Maybe there's a kind of coin toss there. Maybe we round to sort of nice whole numbers nearby to make things easier. We do this by legislation. Hopefully the legislators are thinking of what's good for us in doing so. Well, if morality is a matter of divine legislation, then God could solve these problems by divine commands. Just commands these parameters. I think there's some problems with this. And they are more serious than other problems, than problems of the rest of divine command theory. One of the puzzles with divine command theory is where we find these divine commands. Well, if they're fairly general kinds of commands like love your neighbor, we have texts that purport to be from God, which have these. But these very specific things, we don't have texts that purport to be from God that have these. I am aware of no religion that gives you this cutoff for benefits between fathers and strangers in their sacred text. There are many sacred texts around the world, but this is just not answered as far as I can tell by any of them. Likewise, you might think it's not contained, details are not contained in, as far as I can tell, any religious tradition, nor even in our intuition. You might think that God speaks his commands through our moral intuitions, but I don't think he puts these answers there. At least it doesn't seem to be. Also, I think it's worth noting that there are Mersenne problems that arise with regard to divine command ethics. So if we take divine command ethics in the literal sense of God commanding things, there are going to be parameters with commands. What is a command? It has to be a speech act that has to be fairly definitive. There's going to be questions of which events in the world count as God's speech acts. Presumably, they're not all actually linguistic in nature, because we've seen that the sacred texts which purport to be the linguistic ones do not, in fact, have the answers to these. So it's going to be enacted in our hearts in some way or something like that. But which of the things in our hearts are divine commands and which are not? It's hard to say. It seems to be kind of, you might say, well, the ones that are caused by God. But everything in the world is caused by God, if God exists. So it's got to be caused by God in some more intimate way, more detailed way. It seems to me there will probably be some parameters there. And the other version of divine command theory is that we should do what God wills rather than what God commands. That could solve some of these problems because God could sit around willing all these numbers. That you should have these cutoffs and these cutoffs and these cutoffs. But it doesn't seem to me that it's reasonable for God to expect us to follow his unexpressed will. It's like the parent who says to a child, "You didn't do what I wanted," and the child reasonably says, "You never told me if you wanted." That seems like a perfectly reasonable answer. What about human nature? This go back to the Aristotelian story. I think human nature can, as a form, specify fine parameters or ranges of parameters as to how we should behave. We could give an answer to the Mersenne question in terms of our nature says so. On the Aristotelian story, outside of ethics, the Aristotelian is committed to thinking that the nature specifies ranges of things. What is the normal size of a heart for a human being? Well, it's at least this much, and at most this much, or it's somewhere probably much narrower range than that. We're going to get natures of things, forms setting parameters for the things that have those forms. Those natures, those parameters are not going to be directly epistemically accessible to us by introspection. We cannot tell by introspection what is the normal height for a human, what is the normal size of a heart for a human, and so on. And likewise, the ethical parameters, we shouldn't expect on the Aristotelian view to be easily accessible, and that fits with what we in fact have. They are not easily accessible. However, the Aristotelian has this third thing, which is that things tend to fulfill their form. So there is a pull towards behaving within the parameters. So I think we can get some insight into what the values of the parameters are. We can reverse engineer it, as Aquinas says, from the behavior of the virtuous. But we're not going to get, complete precision there, and we know that there are very few of the completely virtuous, if any. I think the natural law story nicely gives you this idea that the ethical parameters depend on the proper ecological niche for this kind of agent as well. In fact, I generally, this is something I really like about natural law, is, so you've got sort of these two opposed views, Kantian universalism, which gives us ethics for all rational beings, and relativism, which makes ethics be different for different beings of the same kind, either because they're different societies or because they're different individuals. Both seem to me to be radical and too radical. It seems to me that very plausible that the right thing to do about ethics is to relativize it to a natural kind, to a kind of thing. I once was teaching philosophy of love and sex, and I had a question that really floored me. The student put up his hand and asked, "But we've been talking in this class all the time about humans." I think he wanted a sexual ethics that would apply to aliens as well. He really did. And that's a mistake, surely, right? Because it's surely going to be different for aliens than for us, at least especially sexual ethics. So I think the kind of relativism to a natural kind seems right, and so it avoids these errors of universalizing too much. So Aristotelian forms give us norms. We could try to define those norms in terms of statistical parameters. That's not going to, I think, work because humans can go wrong as a collective. Say tribalism was, and perhaps still is, a majority view. We could try in terms of evolutionary definitions of norms in terms of patterns of behavior that conduce to the survival of the species. I don't think that's going to work. I think amongst our duties are hypothetical duties towards non-human persons, should we ever meet them. Perhaps we have already met them. Perhaps God. Perhaps dolphins. But the evolutionary stuff is not going to give us duties towards those because those don't conduce to the survival of our species. But most of all, what bothers me about an evolutionary grounding for these norms is that it makes the answers to ethical questions depend on ancient prehistory. What evolved for what? Hundreds of thousands, at least, years ago. And that doesn't seem right. That seems ethically irrelevant. What happened back then doesn't seem relevant to what I ought to do now. Ethical norms, I think, should be intrinsic to us. And that's what I think the Aristotelian gives us. I think that's also a problem with Platonic versions of the stories, that norms are not intrinsic to us. Okay, let me quickly give one other kind of application. We also have Mersenne questions in epistemology. So William James notes that you have sort of two different kinds of characters. There's the kind of character who cares more about avoiding error, and the kind of character that cares more about grasping at truth. The kind of person who cares about grasping for truth is willing to go with more speculative inferences, while the other one is going to be more cautious. And James said, and I think rightly so, that both of these people can be quite reasonable. Yes, both of them can be reasonable as long as they don't go to extremes, right? It's obviously really stupid to believe nothing lest you ever go wrong, or to believe everything lest you miss out on some truth. And I mean everything, including P as well as not P, for all P. So we should stay away from the extremes, but how far away from the extremes should we go? We've got a Mersenne question. We've got questions about the speed of induction. So you observe billions of black ravens, and your credence that all ravens are black is still 0.8. You're too cautious. You've seen 2 black ravens, and now it's 99%. You're not cautious enough. It's got to be somewhere in between. I doubt that there's a precise parameter, a precise value that we all ought to be at. I doubt we have uniqueness in these answers. But whether we do or we do not, some answers are reasonable, some are not, and we have a question as to why the reasonable thing is where it is. I won't go into the details of this because time is running out. We've got the famous Bayesian problem of priors. So Bayesian epistemology, which I think is at least approximately right, says we gather evidence and we update the probabilities we have for various things on the basis of the evidence that comes in. However, crucial thing is that in a Bayesian epistemology is that where you start determines where you are at now. So, for instance, if you start by thinking that there is no chance at all, that there's literally zero probability that there will be an inverse square law of gravitation, no amount of evidence you observe is going to push you past that, because it would be like looking for evidence that 2 + 2 isn't 4 from your point of view. And if you just assign a sufficiently tiny value to that, then the historical evidence that convinced Newton and others just won't convince you, because you thought this is just so absurd. More relevantly, you might have this issue with God, right? So some people, think the reasonable sort of prior probability for God is 1/2. Some people think it's 10 to the minus 100. I think those who say it's 10 to the minus 100 are fairly clearly unreasonable. But we can argue about that if we want to. But in any case, there are reasonable things to set your prior probabilities at, and there are unreasonable ones. And we've got the Mersenne question as to what makes it be what it is. And John Hawthorne has suggested, and I think he's right, that this is one of the places where a relativity to the kind of agent seems reasonable. The kind of ecological niche an agent occupies might affect what are reasonable sets of priors. So, for instance, or niche even in a very broad sense, if you're the sort of agent that's embedded in a universe with really nice and elegant laws of nature, maybe the right kind of priors for you are the nicer ones. The ones that assign a higher probability to nice and elegant laws of nature. But those in crummy universes should be otherwise. Maybe the characteristic form of life should affect how cautious the agent is with jumping to conclusions. You could imagine a natural kind like humans, where each individual is very precious and somewhat fragile. In such a community, maybe epistemic caution is called for. But on the other hand, you could have maybe either a community of very strong beings that easily can withstand damage, or else a community where the individuals do not matter much, like somewhat intelligent ants, where the individuals are not very important. In that case, maybe jumping to conclusions might be the right way for the society to explore epistemic options. So I think we have some reason to think that the parameters in epistemic practice should be relative to a kind. And we can give a natural law epistemology. We should think in ways that are normal, given our nature. Also, the parameters governing rational thought are at least somewhat accessible to us, because again, we've got this Aristotelian idea that our nature guides our behavior. And so our behavior is guided towards the goals set by the nature, and so majority practice tends to be within the normal range. And so one can try to reverse engineer what the parameters are from majority practice, which is kind of what we do when we're doing certain kinds of philosophy of science, at least as restricted to the majority of scientists. We try to figure out what are reasonable, what inferences they would make, and think what kind of priors they probably have. So the broad range of epistemic parameters in typical human practice, which we can reverse engineer from human behavior, on this kind of natural law epistemology, is a guide to what is normative to humans. But it's not what defines the normative, since it is possible, though unlikely, that everyone be irrational in most things. You could imagine that happening to the human race. You might even think it has happened to the human race for theological reasons of the fall or other pessimistic reasons. I don't want to be that pessimistic myself. What defines the normative isn't the statistics, but human nature itself. So, tentative conclusions we'll continue next time. Human nature, on this theory, answers the Mersenne question of why the lines are drawn where they are. Our nature is a genuine metaphysical component in us, a form, and hence it's something intrinsic to us. The rules that it sets up for us are not alien rules coming from the commands of a God outside of us, or alien rules coming from evolutionary history that hundreds of thousands of years ago, or from Platonic forms. They are in us. They are part of what makes us be us. We can, however, ask, why do we have this nature? Now, the easy answer is we can have no other, because our nature is essential to us, but that doesn't quite answer the why do we have this nature question, because probably the right answer is question is something like, why do the dominant bipeds on Earth have this nature rather than any of the other natures they could have with other norms? Next time, we'll talk about that question, as well as some of the other things that forms can help with. Thank you.